Welcome to the Signal Pulse Pod. I'm here with author Brent Buchanan.
New title.
We're recording this on December 3rd. Brent's book just came out on December 1st already. A number one new release on Amazon. So it's been a really big week at Signal, and it's been a lot of fun working on this book with you, Brent. How are you feeling now that it's out?
I'm glad it's done. I read it literally 11 times in the editing process, cut, I don't even know how many words out of it, which was a great recommendation that you made, by the way, of, this doesn't really add to the book, so let's take it out. And I'll never read it again. So I hope everybody else reads it and lets me know what they think of it, because after 11 runs, I feel like whatever there is to get out of it for me, I've got.
Yeah, I think I went through it, 5 times personally, and there's definitely let me tell you, everybody that's going to read this, the first 4 times, very instructive. There are some diminishing returns after you get past 4. But for anybody that has bought the book, I would recommend at least one read and a reread, because there's a lot of great stuff in there. This has been a really fun process, working on this, getting to this point. And so we wanted to do have another conversation today about the book and writing the book and kind of what went into some of the subject matter that you wrote about. So we'll start with what inspired you to write America's Emotional Divide, and why did you choose to publish it 1 year after Trump's election?
Well, when you first said, "Hey, Brent, I think you should write a book," I thought you had my best interest at heart. And after going through the process of writing a book, I now question your interest for me. No, I'm kidding. It was a long process, but I think it was actually fast in terms of like normal book publishing, that from idea an initial outline in March to like book in hand on December 1st. And so part of the reason that we wanted to publish it now was if we went through a traditional publishing route, this thing wouldn't come out until, I don't know, late summer of next year. And now we're kind of in the midterms, and I think the moment would be lost. And so that's why we went the self-publishing route. But why write the book in the first place? And I've been doing polling for a long time, and a lot of it is an academic exercise in, okay, we think this is what the options are. We think this is what the questions are. And we get that right a lot of times. But it can happen that you follow exactly what that quantitative poll says to do, the right message to the right people through the right medium, and then the numbers don't change. And that was happening enough that I was like, there's got to be something else that we're missing. Like, what is that key that we're missing and unlocking here? And so I decided, okay, look, I'm going to go to academic literature, and I'm going to see what political science and behavioral economics and other disciplines say about what makes people make decisions. And then that led me to how people process information. And I wrote this book really in the sense that I didn't want anybody else to have to go read through hundreds and hundreds of pages of academic research. Unless that's your thing, then, have at it. So in summarizing that, but I felt it needed a story, or it was going to be like reading academic research. And then it needed data wrapped around that story to really understand what made it happen. So this book is about the 2024 presidential election, but only as a case study. It's not simply meant to explain the 24 presidential election. It's using it as the story of how do people process information emotionally? What impact does that have? What are factors that are causing everything to be hyper emotional now, and people reacting so explosively to basically everything in their lives? And so it lays out what I believe are the pieces that go into this kind of hyper emotional state everybody finds themselves in. And then how do politicians and business leaders lead out of that in a positive way?
Yeah, I mean, Brent, you've been in the political game for a long time now. You've been a pollster and political strategist as long as I've known you, decades now, which is hard to believe. But how did that shape the research and the insights in this book?
It's a really good question. I mean, being a pollster lets me and the team be part of hundreds of political and policy efforts. I mean, literally thousands if you count them now, to understand where our voters, how to communicate with them that moves them in a certain way. And one thing that you have taught me, since I can be a bit bristly and headstrong at times, is that communication is not about what you say, it's about what's received. And there's just some fundamental pieces of like, how do you understand a human and how do you talk to them, that I think gets lost in the art of what an ad should look like, or let's tweak this script this exact way. And as opposed to stepping back and saying, like, what is the tone in which we need to strike? Where are people? I just had a call this morning with one of our corporate clients and saying, like, you can't execute this communications plan unless you understand where people are, because you're this much of their life, maybe even less. Their life is this big. So you have to understand what the background that they're experiencing is. And so I think being able to see so many backgrounds per se, that we're seeing data constantly from all over the country, literally all over the world, and being able to string together like these common themes that we're seeing occur. We saw the affordability thing before Democrats. I mean, we talked about it on this poll spot. I sat in this chair and talked about it 4 months ago, that we were seeing it in the data before Democrats were making that their key message in these midterm, these, off-year elections. So, I think that being able to see so much of that really allows us to go in and say, like, this is the other part we've got to be thinking about.
Yeah, my favorite part of this whole book process was working on the foreword for this book and trying to get it in front of Glenn Beck to agree to write it. What do you think his perspective adds to the book's message, and why pick him?
Well, he is, I don't know the right word for this, but malcontent's not the right word, but he's a contrarian, I guess, is the better word for it, and always has been. When I first started out of high school working, because I worked all the full time all the way through college, went to college at night and online, and then built this business after that. Had another business in between, but all of those required me driving a lot. So I got a car with XM. This is like there was Sirius and there was XM. This is, pre-merger.
You had to pick one of the two.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I picked XM. Glenn Beck was on XM every day. And about the time that I was always driving in the car. So I grew up politically on Glenn Beck. His worldview, even back then, this is before he was an author. Like, this is before he wrote The Overton Window, which I think was one of his first books. And he was talking about issues no one else talked about. And if he was talking about the issues people were talking about, he was talking about it from a different perspective. And many of the topics in this book have been on Glenn Beck's radar for years. He's been like the one person in the wilderness shouting out the message, a political John the Baptist in a way. And that really imprinted on me. And so when I've finished with the book and we were talking about who should the forward be, I mean, it was first Charlie Kirk,
right?
Which we wrote that and it went to his team, and then
tragedy struck.
Yes. And so after that, being able to go to Glenn, and I really think that his forward is the perfect summation of why the book is true and what lessons need to be taken from it.
Yeah, it is really, really good. I want to go back to something you just kind of keyed on and shift gears a little bit and talk about Charlie Kirk. I mean, obviously we opened the book with Charlie Kirk, which was not the case when we wrote the first draft of this, when Brent was working on the first draft. I mean, all of this was kind of happening as we were really in the very last stages of finishing up the book. I think Brent had already finished his first manuscript. Why was his journey and tragic death so central to the book's narrative, and why was it important to you to take the time to go back and build that piece about him? After, like you said, you'd asked him to write the foreword, and certainly that would have been incredible. But we could have just left that on the floor, but we felt like we wanted to go back and even push the book's release back a little bit so we could write about this. What was that about?
Well, I've always had the utmost respect for Charlie and agreed with him on essentially everything. And the way he spoke was at the level of principles and values, and not just issues. And he spoke boldly about his faith first, and politics was second. And I think that's a lesson that people only picked up on after the fact of his assassination. And seeing somebody be martyred for what they believe that you also believe, like that's jarring in the industry in which you operate. And I kind of look at this as like these out of control emotions and rhetoric and the failure of institutions and a lot of the pieces that I talk about in the book. Like that is why we find ourselves in this moment. But there's also there's a verse in scripture that talks about how God takes beauty out of ashes. He makes beauty from ashes. And so I wanted this book to be both a tribute to Charlie and what he worked for, and a building block for others like him to learn how to understand people and connect with them at a visceral level, but then move them and point them towards the optimistic future, which is really the thematic of the book. And so that's why I wanted to go in and rework the portion start and end with Charlie Kirk and his mission and who he was as a person, but then also woven into multiple chapters as again, examples of the 2024 story of why this is relevant, why this is true, and how people can use this effectively.
Yeah. Is there anything that you hope readers take away from his story specifically? Like you said, we kind of bookend the book with beginning with Charlie and ending with Charlie.
It would be look past what he's saying, and when you rewatch those clips, that thank goodness the algorithms are still putting in a lot of people's feeds, maybe even more now than when he was alive. Like look past just the words in the conversation being had and look at how is that being delivered and what story is he wrapping around these principles and these values and these truths. Because just to go in and say exactly the words Charlie said would fall flat with anybody else. It was how he did it and how he connected, and how he was authentic and vulnerable in those. That's the takeaway from his story.
Yeah, I totally agree. Let's zoom out just a little bit and kind of talk about, the main themes of the book. America's emotional divide. Is that more about politics, culture, or do you think it's something deeper?
I think they're all intermixed. And that's one of the things that we get into in the book is that politics is pervasive in everything now, but it doesn't mean that politics is necessarily running everything and driving it all. But the emotions that are causing politics to be more pervasive are also affecting everything else is the takeaway there. And, just again, to use a story in this, think back to 9/11 if you were around then. And we all felt the same way the day that happened. I mean, I remember going up to my church in Montgomery, Alabama, and having a prayer service and hundreds of people showing up. And like, we had just all watched the same thing, experienced the same thing, felt the same way about that. And you could even look at polling and see this massive national unity, strong support for our country's leaders at that time. And then you got to ask yourself why. Because we all experienced that and we felt those same emotions. And then fast forward to today, and it's almost like the opposite of unity in that. And a lot of the factors in that of the pieces of, the diploma divide has shifted that we get into in the book. High levels of institutional distrust, this media fragmentation that's forced us all into our own worlds. Like I think if a 9/11 happened again, we wouldn't experience it the same way because we weren't all just watching the few news channels that were available. We would all instantly have conspiracies hitting our social media feeds that didn't really exist at that time. So there's these factors that drive into, as I was mentioning at the beginning, this like hyper emotionalism that everybody's experiencing. And we're all overloaded, we're overstimulated, we're overconcerned, and it boils over. We were not biologically built to have 1,000 tabs open in our mental browser, but that is where we are today. And so this divide comes from how we're uniquely experiencing the world differently. And what we see is the cause of that and the concern, and then how do we address that? And that's what, it's more about how we're experiencing the modern world and the governments that have failed us than it is about politics. But yes, it's something deeper too, and that is the emotional divide.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you just said. You mentioned institutional distrust. How do you feel like that's played into shaping voter behavior into 2024?
I think it really came to a head in 2024, but it's been brewing for a long time, years in the making. And I think a lot of it is like the right just abandoned institutions. When was the last time somebody on the right tried to make inroads into colleges and universities? Like Charlie Kirk was one of the first people to really do that, one man. But you look at the media, like we gave up on the media decades ago on the right. And so, this is on top of the fact that I think that the institutions that were built to promote America and democracy and other things post-World War II no longer serve the purposes that they used to serve. And when you look at this in the broader scope of not just governments, not just institutions, but like when people feel something is no longer working for them, they're going to take action by voting to change that. And then you go one step further, and if people feel like these institutions and these systems are actually working against them, that's where you get revolt. And you move from people desiring reform to wanting revolution. And all of this is caused by these feelings driven by perceived attacks on our safety and security. You know, Maslow's hierarchy of need. What is the base foundation of the pyramid? And it is safety and security, even above shelter. And when that base need is, you feel threatened everywhere you turn, and that this government that's supposed to be helping you is actually now threatening your safety and security, you're going to act differently than if you feel like your safety and security needs are met.
Yeah. I think we both, we've been in politics for a while. If you pick up this book and read it and you're working politics, I mean, I think the appeal is instantaneous. I mean, you're already experiencing a lot of these things. And so a lot of what you've written here is just kind of giving, you just said it a second ago, it's kind of putting a name and really outlining, what we've really been experiencing, for the last decade in our politics that have really kind of come to the head in the 2024 election. But there's also a lot in this book that I think is really valuable for business leaders. I just interested as to, what you think, how do you think the emotional divide affects business in corporate America? And you made a point to make sure include these takeaways for, business leaders. What do you want them to take away from this book?
But before we jump into that, can we talk about the diploma divide? Because I think that's another important piece of like the causes of a lot of what we're experiencing here. And, if you look and think back historically, both parties were set up from a policy and an election machine perspective to appease and turn out voters of the old divide. The country club Republicans. What does that mean? Well, highly educated, higher income people were Republicans. And what does that mean for the Democrats? They were the party of the working class. And in this new diploma divide, whereby non-college educated voters make up the growing majority of the Republican Party, it's really causing problems for both parties because Democrats have turned off working class voters with these, far left ideologies like transgenderism and that, we should let boys play in girls' sports. While the Republicans have turned off college educated voters as they've gone after and sought this new base of non-college educated voters. And so both parties are at this weird odd split where, and I think an example of this is that most voters still feel the Republicans are the party for wealthy people, even though the bases of the parties don't bear that out anymore. And so I find this interesting in that this is some data from one of our recent surveys that non-college educated voters have actually soured on Trump. Now we're going in the field later this week, so I don't know if the trend continues or reverses itself, but as of our November data, they have soured. They were +1 favorable of Trump at the beginning of 2024 as the election starting to kick off, then get all the way up to September of this year to +16. So +16 more favorable than unfavorable. And now it's -5 unfavorable. Like that is drastic changes over essentially a 2-year period with an election in between and a new admin. And a lot of this is driven by the minority non-college voters that came over to Trump during the last election. And the reason I give this example is because emotions are fickle. They change. If you're not paying attention to them and you're only looking at, the top issue question, you're not understanding what the real driver is of this. And so that's why I wanted to bring that up before we jumped into the business piece, because I think that even that is affecting businesses too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would love to hear you talk about how you feel like what you just talked about applies to businesses.
Well, whether they like it or not, business and government and politics are all tied at the hip now. And as government grows, and you could see this in Europe to an extent, I always look to Europe as like what it potentially is 15 years down the road from us. That's a dumb idea. And, as business grows, as government grows, businesses' dependence on government grows. And as that grows, then government's dependence on business grows. And I think you can kind of see this. And, I now know what the word oligarchy means. But I think that's a great example of like somebody calling foul, whether you agree with it or not, of Like there is this massive tie-in of business and government now that doesn't exist. So because of that, everyone now expects everyone else to take a political position, including businesses and CEOs. Government policies and regulations touch businesses way more than they did even 10, 20 years ago. And now, quote, staying out of politics is a statement in and of itself. And so an example of this would be that consumers are increasingly seeing brands as like identity expressions of themselves. And these same cultural anxieties that drive voting behavior are also influencing purchasing decisions, where people choose to work, what they're going to invest their money in. And so thinking about this from a story example perspective would be like if you're trying to convince, if you're a business trying to convince voters that we need to shift to electric vehicles, and because this was a big discussion, Democrats were the party of the electric vehicles, and then Elon Musk got involved in the campaign. Now they are not the party of electric vehicles. And what drove that? Well, there was college-educated voters who are now Democrats wanting that, and then having an emotional reaction to an individual, and then changing their policy positions because of one guy who happens to make some electric vehicles. So, with this, these business leaders have got to develop emotional intelligence to navigate these waters, understanding what are they angry of? As I was talking about the backdrop earlier, like what is that emotional backdrop in which my company now has to operate and sell and recruit and hire and bring investors to the table? This essentially needs to be a KPI. Like they need to track the emotions that are going on in general and of their customer and potential customer base as much as they're tracking their net promoter score.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The Tesla example is such a perfect example of, like you said earlier, I mean, emotions are so fickle. And so it's, they totally abandon a policy position because they really dislike this one guy that is, manufacturing electric vehicles. And so, you mentioned, obviously they need to be tracking this like a KPI, but, it doesn't seem like things are going back. There is no, business and politics are inextricably linked now. And you said this just a second ago. Even not having an opinion is really, people expect you to have an opinion. And if you don't, some people are going to hold you to account for not having an opinion. So what can brands do to avoid alienating some of those emotionally driven customers? Or is it just that they have to pick a lane and get in it?
Well, it's a really good question. And again, it goes back to what is broadly happening. And if you looked at the emotional shifts that we saw ahead of the affordability concern shifts, like that's a great example of figuring out what is happening under the surface before it pops its head up, and being able to take this qualitative thing of emotions and turn it into a quantitative piece. That's why we built the Heartbeat platform, is to take the qualitative aspect of this and make it quantitative. And so being able to see and understand and track those, and what are the words people are using, because speaking to values and principles casts a much wider net than talking about policies and specifics. And so being able to speak more broadly to audiences figures, it starts with, okay, what is the broadest principle that's going to unite? What's the broadest value that's going to unite everybody? But that alone is not going to check the box. That is you get their head to come up and say, okay, I think I agree with that. They're going to want a little bit more meat on those bones. And that is the hardest part, is figuring out what are those different lanes that you're going to put together that don't alienate somebody else in another lane. It's no different than a politician, where you don't want them walking into this Rotary Club and saying one thing and then going and saying something opposite of that at the Kiwanis Club the next day. And so, but you can speak differently to the two audiences, but say the same thing in a different way with a different tone. That's the key, but it's the hardest part to come up with.
Well, and if you don't stick to your principles, voters, consumers, whoever, eventually they're going to hold you to account for that too. And so, you got to talk the talk and obviously figure out how to navigate that comms piece. But then, at some point you got to walk the walk, or your customer base is going to leave you. Moving on to just kind of getting into how you wrote the book. We did a lot of original research for this book. You mentioned emotional analytics, that the Heartbeat platform that Signal has spent a lot of time developing and investing in to put some quantitative to have a quantitative look at this emotion data. What were some of the things that surprised you as we were doing all this research for the book? And was there anything that shifted unexpectedly, or emotions that proved more influential than you maybe thought they were going to be when you started?
Well, I first want to say this was a massive research project. It was by far the largest qualitative undertaking we've ever done. So we surveyed, I don't even remember how many thousands of voters we surveyed of the 2024 election, but then we also surveyed people who voted in 20 but didn't vote in 24, because we wanted to figure out what was the drop off and why, and what was driving that piece. So huge shout out first off to Mike Kemp for doing this. I mean, I don't even know how many dozens or potentially hundreds of hours he put into it, because it's a lot of work to do, which is why most people don't do heavy qualitative work, because of the effort that goes into it, especially making it quantitative. That's a big lift. So the thing that stuck out to me the most on this was how much illegal immigration was actually a cultural issue. And what I mean by that, and it was like a positive cultural issue, which you wouldn't think that anger around illegal immigration would actually be a positive. That was probably the biggest thing that stuck out. But they were seeking to protect their heritage. The emotions behind it were kind of centered around like the importance of boundaries, and not just literal physical boundaries, but this was a value thing more than just build the wall was, which is why I think it was even more powerful in 24 than it was in 2016 when Donald Trump first ran on this. It was about their love of their family and their country and their desire to protect them, those both, their confidence in the future of what it could look like when we solve this problem. And nobody was talking about, we weren't even talking about illegal immigration in that sense, but this research helped us see how that was a cultural, potentially positive, a negative is a positive driver behind this. And so I was also surprised at how much and how powerful the emotions were around cultural issues in general, like men and women's sports and the transgendered issue, which you can't run an entire campaign on those two things alone, but they're a really good way to say this other party is insanely extreme. Like, this is not a 50-50 issue. This is like an 80-20 issue. And how there was frustration and criticism around the economic pieces in the 24 election, but the powerful emotions were behind the cultural issues.
If you could give one piece of advice to someone trying to persuade or unite a divided audience, what would it be?
Well, first you got to understand, and I know I feel like a broken record on this, and when you read the book, you'll think I'm even more of a broken record. You got to understand the emotions these people are feeling in general. You can't just walk in with your topic and your emotion set and not acknowledge the others. People are looking to be understood and heard. It is why, from a campaign and election perspective, nobody says this as a voter, but this is what has biologically happened. Does this person understand somebody like me? Like, that is the question that emotions are tuned to get the answer to, and then make the vote choice based on not all, significant majority driven by emotion. So you got to understand the backdrop of the emotions. Then you got to understand them on your issue or your campaign specifically. And then from there, seek out the commonality we were talking to earlier. What's the broader value set? What are the kind of legs of the stool that go to the top of the stool there? And work about uniting people with this, and don't use it as a cudgel. Don't use it out of manipulation, because voters are way more attuned to picking out BS than they ever have been before. I mean, just think about you're flipping through your reels and all of a sudden you're like, oh, that one's AI generated. And it could be incredibly well done, but like, you just can feel there's something not human about it. And the same thing applies in messaging.
Before we wrap this up, let's look out into the future. We talk a lot about the polling isn't predictive. It's a snapshot in time. So maybe I'm asking you to go out a bit on a limb here. But do you think America's emotional divide is going to heal or deepen or just evolve into something else? And what do you think's in the future, and what kind of hope do you have?
This reminds me of in the year 2000. I think until we fix the structural issues, this hyper emotional environment and the reactions that come from it, I don't see them getting better. But in the interim, I think everybody's got to, everyone who has a voice can have influence, and you don't have to be a leader of something. This is going to fix from the ground up, not the other way around. And the more people who are attuned to how do we have these conversations, the more types of people like Charlie Kirk who are willing to be bold and authentic on both sides of the aisle. This doesn't need to be just a one side's having a conversation piece. That is going to play into some of the healing and some of the commonality that we can find. But if we're not talking to each other at all, we're living in these different universes, where even your and my universe is totally different from what we're consuming, what we're seeing, what's being like. I bet you don't have a bunch of F1 stuff in your feed right now, but I do, because Abu Dhabi's coming up, on Sunday. But that's a great example of like how different our worlds are, even though if you put us both on paper, from a market research perspective, we'd probably be getting the same targets because we're pretty similar in education level and we live in the same place and have a lot of kids, but yet we live in two different worlds. And so, I put it on the politicians for either reforming or revolutionizing these institutions and government and really making them work for the broad set of people, again, which is going to be hard. That is a big, huge lift. But the other is, what can the individuals do with this information and with this knowledge and with each other? And that's where I do see some hope, but I think it's made much harder without fixing some of the institutional underpinnings of these challenges.
That's a great answer, Brent. Brent, it was a pleasure talking to you today. I really enjoyed working on the book with you. Everybody, go out and get your copy on Amazon. #1 new release.
In elections.
Not
all of Amazon. We'll get there. If you go buy this book, we will get there of all of Amazon.
And he's humble too, guys. Thanks for taking the time today. Thanks for writing this book. And we certainly hope that, all the people out there who have already supported it, that you really enjoy it. And we're just thankful for all the encouragement and support we've already gotten for it.
A lot. Really appreciative.
Looking forward to the next one.
Ooh, you don't like me.
All right. Thanks, Brent.